Hello, everyone. Awesome. My name is Lexi Papaspirou, and I work for a tech consultancy called Sparta Global. And I'm here today to facilitate a fantastic panel on tech for good. So I'd like to start by getting our fantastic panel to introduce themselves, if that's okay. So can we please start over with Holly?
Hi, I'm Holly. I am a software engineer at Microsoft, so I work on Cortana for Windows. Previously, I've worked on Paint 3D and Xbox. I'm originally from Seattle, but moved to the UK 4 years ago.
Hi, I'm Lucy McDonald. I'm the engineering lead in the servicing lab, which is part of engineering transformation at Lloyds Banking Group.
Hi everyone, I'm Lucy Rickards. I work for a company called Alfa. We specialise in the asset finance industry, which to most people is the leasing industry. I've had a variety of roles, both internal and client-facing there. At the moment, I'm a senior architect, which means I spend a lot of time looking at our roadmap for our main product, which is also called Alfa, and providing general sort of technical advice and support to our software developers.
Okay, I'm Joy Foster, and I'm the founder of TechPixies, and we help women who've taken a career break, upskill, and return to work, but we're also now working with women who want to transition careers or who want to start businesses.
Hi, I'm Dhruv. I run a foundation that focuses on raising awareness about plastic pollution, but now we also have an accelerator to find new businesses, startups, new materials, new business models to give them the scale and distribution they need to really have a dent in the plastics economy.
Cool, thank you very much, everyone. So my first question that I'd love to put to all of you is, you're all working in very different roles. I would love to get an understanding of why you are on a panel for Tech for Good. So feel free to jump in. I'll tell you what, let's start with, let's start with Joy.
We talked about this a bit before. So I set up TechPixies initially as a social enterprise. It still is a social enterprise. So we are a for-profit company, but the goal is to be serving women who have taken career breaks and coming back. So our pricing is very affordable, and we are really effectively changing their lives by providing them with life coaching and a new digital skill set, which combined is very, very powerful. So I think what I'm looking forward to is what we get to do with those profits when we have them, and how we reinvest them into, let's say, sectors of the community where they can't afford to do our courses, for example. So that's probably why I have been asked to sit on the panel. I also have run 2 social enterprises before setting up TechPixies. Both of them are still running. I'm no longer involved in them, but they both involve technology as well.
Well, hi. I have a technical background as well, but not anymore. But I really believe that technology can solve some of the problems we have right now, especially in the plastic sector, to really help us scale the solutions we have. And because I have a lot of exposure to tech, as well as new materials and new startups, entrepreneurs, and I'm also very involved with a lot of deep policy and things like that. So I think it helps me to understand both the sides of the coin and find out what can fix the problems we have. I'm not necessarily looking for technology to solve my problems. I'm looking to solve the problems, and technology can be an enabler to scale them.
So I work for Lloyds Banking Group, so immediately when you say that banking itself doesn't have a great reputation from a social perspective in recent years. I also work on the commercial side, which again is very conservative. It's not at the forefront of technology. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity, and really it's a point where you can evangelize about the opportunity that actually there is a social consciousness, not only within the wider LBG organization, but right down to the lab that I work in and the feature teams, which have an agile approach. They too are made up of a lot of diverse and young people, and I think it can open up a real opportunity for individuals to be part of a collective social change.
I guess from my point of view, it's something I care about personally very much. But also, I've seen a real shift over the years I've been in the industry. It's something that certainly Alfa employees really expect of their company, and something that they want is that we actually give something back as well as our day-to-day work.
Well, I have to agree with Lucy on this. That's one of the reasons why I quite like Microsoft. And so environmentalism and sort of animal rights and really just having some like a positive impact on the world is a really important issue to me. And that was something identified with Microsoft's core priorities. And so Microsoft is constantly working with like nonprofits or the community to try to set up initiatives and use our technology to try to help others. And so that's something that I feel good about when I am working on my products, is that I know that they have sort of like higher goals in mind. Like it's literally written in our mission statement, is to try to like empower like everybody on the planet to achieve more, or to like be the best that they can, and to help the planet be the best it can itself. And so I guess I'm here as a representative to try to share all the good that Microsoft has done, and to try to help inspire other people to use technology for good in the same way that Microsoft is trying to do.
Cool, thanks everyone. I'm hearing a very strong theme here of either people who are leading their business functions or have set up their own businesses, because we're all very passionate about doing good, and whether you're sort of a sole contributor in a larger organisation that's responsible for making positive change, or whether you're actually leading a charge on something particular, there's this running thread of wanting to really do good for the world. Do you think that we do have tech companies out there that actually are different to this outlook? I ask this question just because I'm wondering about things like the draw of like the marketing appeal of appearing to be a good company, but maybe not having values that go all the way through the company. Do you think that's a danger for tech for good? Do you think that separation of tech for good versus tech is still necessary? What are your thoughts?
I think there's a real live debate around trust at a global level. And a lot of people have lost trust in large organizations, NGOs, and in actual fact, if you look at any surveys, people say that millenniums trust themselves more than they trust institutions. So I think there's a real imperative in an organization to lay out its social agenda and use that as a strong thread for attracting and getting people together in a way that they want to work, not only for the subject or content of that organization, but for the higher value of why they're there with other people.
I was going to say, for me personally, I guess I've noticed that there have been like studies that have come out that show that people particularly try to buy from companies that they know support their same values. So this is why people end up trying to put on like not tested on animals, or this is zero carbon product, or this was sustainably like sourced like materials, things like that, because it impacts their like where they spend their money. And so it's interesting that not necessarily every company needs to be like tech for good, but now there is actual business value placed on being sustainable and being like making sure that their products have like good impacts on the world. So it's an interesting shift that I'm seeing, and we've always, like people have always said, where it's like your money is your buying power. This is how you're going to influence companies, and I think we're finally starting to get to a point where this is starting to reflect across lots of different industries. You can see, at least coming from like, I guess, my American background, there's lots of big companies that I think are really powered by like greed and just money and power, and then don't end up focusing on trying to help others outside of the realm of influence. And so hopefully now that their customers and their consumers are telling them with their money that these are their important values, that we'll hopefully start to see those companies that were traditionally not very good even just take them on just because of the business value, even if maybe it doesn't really connect with their philosophies. So we'll see.
Talking about like real hard tech, say Facebook, for example, let's put the name out there. And there are many other businesses like, they're sitting on this gold mine of data, tech, human behavior, social engineering, and bits and pieces. And we have That's Facebook is just one example, but you've got many more businesses sitting on gold mine data, and they know a lot about what's going on. They can actually drive people's thinking and bits and pieces. I think what is missing right now is also AI, is regulation around this stuff. Because without regulation, this is where we are at today with Cambridge Analytica and everything that came up, because there is no defined regulation, and people could do whatever they want to do. But it's been tricky now with the UK government coming up with a lot of regulations like a few weeks ago. But then again, we need to be able to, as citizens, know who owns the data, what's going to happen to the data. And I think all these companies can do so much if they actually show the good side of what they're trying to do. But then, because there's no regulation and it's all driven by profit, and it's all driven by the number of views or number of consumers, it's just getting escalated. I think at one point we need to start regulating these businesses, but making sure that startups don't suffer, because now Facebook is very happy to be regulated because they have all the legal team to solve it out. But we really need to control this AI and everything before they start controlling us, because it is going out of control, and especially in countries in the Far East who are really using the data to really be the Uncle Sam that we think don't exist. Yeah, we need to regulate somehow. I don't know. It's very complicated.
Cool, thanks, Joy. I actually want to pass that to Joy, because obviously, Joy, you run your own business, you've run businesses before, so I'd love to hear your thoughts around the idea of regulating more and how that can help. Would it help you? Does it actually change your ability to do tech for good?
I grew up in a Republican family in America, so regulation is like the dirty word in my house. I thought it was interesting when Mark Zuckerberg, who went to my high school, by the way, he was a freshman the year I was a senior, he wrote his letter saying, regulate us, and then of course all the politicians were like, we are not going to listen to this guy saying to regulate us. So I do think this regulation issue is really tricky and expensive, and and I have to say GDPR wreaked havoc on small businesses, because it was actually designed for the Googles and the Facebooks. It was not designed for the small business people, yet we all got hit with it. And GDPR actually, for example, as a regulatory thing that came in place in the last year, actually I think was good for business. I think it was really good for business. It didn't stop most of the emails that I was getting from most of the companies, but I do think sometimes regulation is good, and you need regulation. Probably a better example, before I get myself into hot water, is in America, they introduced Title IX to make women's sports teams in universities have equal numbers as men's, because at the time the problem was the men's teams had a lot of funding and a lot of athletes, and the women's teams didn't. And my husband and I are both athletes, and we've had this conversation a lot. Was that beneficial? Did it work? Did it not work? And I've always argued that Title IX was good, because what Title IX did to America was it brought rowing into the universities, which then meant that we got these incredible rowers that went on to win gold medals like nonstop for the United States. So, and really incredible athletes. And then by bringing the US up, it brought everybody else up. So my long-winded answer to that is regulation is a great prompter. I think it's difficult because what you're regulating with the big guys and what you're regulating with the little guys, it's hard, because the impact is different. And when you change a rule on a little guy, it can really, really impact them in a way that it doesn't affect the Facebooks at all.
Well, I can say a little bit about it from the point of view of Alfa. For us, regulatory changes tend to be a good thing, because we support our clients in it, and ultimately it means more business and more work for us if we have to adapt to a new regulatory change. I do have a great deal of sympathy, though, for small business, though, because it's something a big business can very easily afford and take on a regulatory change. But if you're a small startup, and these things often come in with very little time to change over, it's very hard for a small company to weather that kind of thing. And it would be very sad if an increase in regulations resulting just all the massive global companies retaining the monopoly and disallowing sort of innovation on the small scale for small business. It's such a hard line to walk.
Cool, thank you, Lucy. That's quite an interesting point that you kind of just led to a little bit there. I was having a chat earlier today with some of the women who are hacking the solution for plastic notions. And one of them was talking about a really interesting idea of trying to localise how we look at trying to make sure that we produce less non-recyclable waste. And I was thinking to myself, well, you know, that's a very much a village approach, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we should look at systems on small scales rather than systems on large scales, and then it's easier to potentially predict for what we can see now to be very negative unintended consequences. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts around dealing with systems that are really complex, where we can't necessarily predict consequences of something that we might, you know, a product that we might put out with best intentions of trying to help a social issue. I'm thinking about something like Uber here as an example, trying to find ways for people to earn more money and give people the opportunity to find a role by driving people around. And obviously there are unintended consequences to something like that. That's obviously quite a hot topic that's been in the news quite a lot. I'd love to get your thoughts around the idea of trying to do good when your tech may fall across large and complicated systems across the world.
It might. I immediately think there might be a difference there depending on what the industry is. So clearly coming from banking, it's heavily regulated. But I think a lot of the debate recently has been about social media. And, you know, I think we're all quite aware that some of the boom and opportunity came from legislation in the States during Clinton's era. And that's manifested into the debate at the moment around the fact that these companies are a platform, but they're not actually taking responsibility for their content and the unintended consequence of that. And I know there's been media attention to the legislation going over the top of that over recent weeks too. And whether people or organisations should self-manage or it should be done more at a government level or even at a global level. So, you know, and then you'll go into the next wave, won't you, of technology, for example, like blockchain. Blockchain would be very interesting on, like, what does that do to companies like Uber? You know, so yeah, I think there's a different answer depending to the industry itself, but it's a very live debate, isn't it?
Well, I think too much regulation at the government level, especially over things like social media, is a real risk point, I think, because you really don't want to get in a situation where it's the government deciding what is and isn't appropriate to publish and isn't appropriate to say. So it's such a tricky thing to regulate properly, at least with individual companies. If you don't like what you're reading in a particular forum, you can move away and go to a different forum. If it's actually at a governmental level, at a legal level, then you're pretty much trapped.
My thought on regulation in that case is it's not agile enough to change. So that's where the tricky part comes, because if you have really heavy regulation on everything, and then suddenly you have an unintended consequence that you weren't anticipating, and then you don't have the regulation agility to change, that's where you get stuck, and that's where the unintended consequences are actually really bad. So I'm not saying I'm anti-regulation. I'm just saying it's got to be agile regulation, because you have to be able to change, you know, with it, and then the companies have to work with it too. But if they don't have the freedom in the first place, they can't develop what they need to develop to do something that changes the world. And that's the part about social media that's really difficult, because there are so many amazing things that have come out of social media. The Me Too movement came out of social media. If we did not have social media, we wouldn't have Me Too. Me Too is literally a hashtag, and that has changed the world. So, you know, yes, there is the dark web, there is all the awful, awful, horrible things that are going on there, but there's also some amazing technology solutions that are combating those. You know, so I think it's the freedom and the agility to recognize that there is an unintended consequence, and then figure out how to fix it. And if you don't have the freedom to fix it quickly, that's where you have bigger problems.
I tend to agree with Joy on this one, especially when things like if you start talking about platforms like Airbnb, where now the unintended consequence of that is that housing prices have increased in these areas, local people are not being able to find homes because they're just Airbnbs, et cetera. And so I guess for me, it's sort of like similar to what you were saying, I guess it needs to be an iterative process where they need to go back and have these discussions, talk to the stakeholders, figure out what's important to them, talk to the experts, figure out where they think there's going to be these unintended consequences, or figure out how they can implement solutions, maybe necessarily before they become problems, and once there are the problems, going back and looking at them and trying to find another solution and just keep building on top of it, as opposed to trying to apply a one solution fits all and then calling it good.
So bringing it to plastics for this thing, waste management, for example. So waste management is different in different parts of the world. It's different in US, it's different in Argentina, or in the Far East in emerging economies, for example. Now in emerging economies, mostly it's an informal system where people walk around with a small bike collecting waste. And now they're trying to formalize that system by small cooperatives and things like that. But now you're coming to solve the problem of waste. Like, how do you reduce the amount of plastic from the economy by encouraging reuse, refill, or even new materials, so that we're not gonna have jobs for these people anymore. So when you start trying to tell them that please be a part of this solution, they're not gonna do it because of political reasons. Because, like, you know what, this is my bread and butter. In New York, the Chinese ladies run the whole deposit return for the bottles. So they're not gonna be a part of you to help you solve the problem because their whole family and the whole economy is dependent on that. But then, obviously, you have to engage with them. So what we're trying to do now is also showing them, like, you're actually a logistics company, or you're doing logistics at the end of the day. Today you're collecting waste, but tomorrow you can be collecting something else, or I can be delivering something else. So we're working on these local communities to give them alternatives, similarly with fishing and things like that. You know, you're fishing, the tourists are there because they love your fish, but keep on fishing, no fish, no tourists. So how can we give an alternative as well? So this is very important. So unintended consequences, but obviously you need to look into how you can help them too, how you can solve it, because otherwise we will never be able to make changes because they're not gonna help you. It's classic change management.
I was going to say, similar to just like the example that you brought up, I know in sort of like in Africa where there are these like different game ranges and they're trying to prevent these like beautiful animals from being killed by poachers, it's really difficult to try, like they need to, for it to be effective, they need to bring in the community and make them support it. And so some of the ways they end up doing it is employing local people to work on these ranges, give them food, like give the animals food, protect them, bring tourists around, things like that. Also, there's in some cases where people who were previously poachers are then actually hired to protect the animals instead. They know what they're looking for, they have all the insight already, but instead are now getting money in such a way that is sustainable and helpful. And so sometimes, I guess, flipping the situation on its head and bringing in those people and making them part of the solution can be the way that these methods can be a lot more effective.
They're also using AI and machine learning now, for example, to recognize all these animals, the whales, the dolphins.
It's very
like,
cool.
You know, Tom, Sam, and then they're using it with drones and everything to really track for animal conservation. They know exactly where they're going and things like that to really know what's going on. I mean, the technology is being used in so many good ways. I'm really impressed by one AI startup that I met a few months ago. You know, in London, we're trying to use AI and machine learning to predict the most efficient way of food delivery, right? These guys are using AI and machine learning to predict airstrikes in Syria. Wow. And to save 20% of the casualties around that area. And they're now scaling up to Sudan and you know, other countries. Obviously, it's a for-profit model again. It's not a non-profit model. Non-profit model will take you so far. You know, it's a for-profit model. They build the technology, just incredible. Like you know, you're really saving lives here. From the US.
I love that you said that, Drew, because you've taken me beautifully on to my next question, which is when there are two ways of looking at a certain question around tech for good. We often come to the non-profit and charities versus the for-profit businesses. What are the strengths and limitations of each way of approaching social good or tech for social good?
So I believe in for-profit. Anything we do, we need to have profit inbuilt in it because only then we will be able to scale and have a bigger impact. I work a lot with plastics, and if you work in a new material or anything, a new zero-waste shop or a reuse concept, it becomes a very nice concept in a council, say in Camden or Clapham or somewhere, but it's never going to scale. There are a lot of solutions like this already, but unless there's profits in it, no one is going to go for it, because we really need the scale and distribution of these big brands, say Unilever, Procter & Gamble, or Virgin and British Airlines, to really get the scale, to really have an impact. Otherwise, these new materials, the new business models will never scale. And that's why I believe that we need to work with profits, definitely. But obviously, non-profit works too, but I'm in a profit space right now.
Yes, that's actually a great question for me. My first company that I set up was actually a non-profit community organization that when I left, I handed over to them, and I worked on it for 5 years, never was paid. I put some money into it to get it off the ground. I got that money back, but that was all I got back for the 5 years. And so when I set up my second company, I said, no, like I want to own this, because if it does well, I want to benefit from it doing well. And actually, I ran that company for a couple years, and then we sold it to one of our employees. And that was it was what could have been a nonprofit. So it was a company called Made with Joy, which was a web development agency, and we took teenagers at risk of long-term unemployment and gave them training in how to build WordPress websites, and then employed them. So that was what the model was. And but I got to a point where I realized that wasn't scalable. I could not scale that, and I really wanted to scale something, and I wanted to have, I'd helped 18 people go through that program, go get jobs, and I thought that's great, but I really want to change like hundreds, if not thousands of lives, and how can I do that? And so I had this idea, TechPixies, and we put it through an accelerator, and it won hands down against the other company that we put through there at the same time. And I went to a lawyer, and I got advice. I said, should I set this up as a nonprofit? Everyone else is telling me that I should, because I can't get the big checks from Facebook and Google and LinkedIn if I don't do the nonprofit thing. But then someone pointed out to me, like, do you have a check, like, written to you from Facebook right now? And I said, well, no, I don't. And they said, well, it's going to take you 10 years to get that. And they were right. It would take me a long time. In fact, I was just speaking to someone today. She's been building relationships for 10 years with Google, and they're just now about ready to write a check to her. And I never would have survived if I tried to do it that way. So for me, 2 reasons that I set up a for-profit company was, one, I had put my life, I have dedicated my life to this. This is my life. This is the future of my family and my future. And I've given up, 11 years of my life. So if this goes well, I want to benefit from it, because we've spent 11 years or however long we have without income. And then the second reason was that I wanted to scale it, and I really wanted to have a bigger impact, and I think we can do that. And also what I'm really excited about is when we cross that threshold from being break-even to for-profit, which is what we're hoping to do in the next year, we have the really unique opportunity of what are we going to do with those profits and where are we going to put them. And I can guarantee you they're not all just going to come straight back into my pocket or into our investors' pockets. So we have an all-female board and an all-female investor group, which I think is very rare. I don't think I know of any other companies that are 100% female-funded and 100% female board. And every single person on that is really looking forward to what we're going to do with those profits for good, So I'm totally on board with that, and I agree the for-profit thing is really important. You can't grow, you can't have that massive impact without it.
Sorry. But again, you can run a for-profit business, but you can still have a non-profit entity with you. So it's not that we are running away from those non-profit and public money. You operate multiple vehicles, but then to really scale, you have to have, because you have employees. You have to pay them, and they have to be incentivized. The only way to get the best talent to work for you, so you can have real impact, is to pay them well. How will you pay them well? Not from your savings. So yeah.
So actually, that's a great point, though, about paying them properly is really important. And actually, in charity work, it's one of the reasons why it's so difficult, because they don't pay very well. And so we actually, we do pay well, and we try to pay well, and we try to increase when we can. So that's definitely a great point.
Cool. So we've got this sort of, I guess, thought from you, Joy, really, around the idea of setting something up, running it yourself, making it really successful, and actually having a really positive outcome, which is lovely. So thank you for sharing your story with us from that point of view. I'd love to kind of bounce off of that then to look at what are some other great companies or tech companies or tech products that all of you feel are really actually finding a lot of success when it comes to doing great tech for good?
Sorry, very quick. So there's HALA systems that's using AI and machine learning to predict airstrikes. Just incredible. So humble.
You don't work for them, right?
So obviously, I guess I have more information on some of the projects that Microsoft has worked on for Tech for Good, and so like one of them, for instance, is around sort of like the conservation efforts, and so a lot of what the sort of like nonprofit community work and like Tech for Good stuff that Microsoft does is based on the back of their Azure like cloud platform, and so in this one example, at least, it took in like millions of photos and thousands of hours of audio files from sensors like all around these wildlife areas, sort of like dissected them to like identify and track these sort of like target species. Then all of this data gets run through, again, Azure statistical models that kinds of produces these like really robust findings and trends that can then be used to guide conservation efforts. And so it's great for me to at least see that these cloud platforms are kind of really like starting to democratize technology for people and make these like once maybe inaccessible algorithms or even computational power kind of become a lot more accessible to people. And so that's just like one example that's been built on Azure, and there's just so many more in Microsoft. At least internally, there's a whole group about just sustainability and nonprofits where Microsoft employees can like opt in to be in these groups. And when companies come to Microsoft, there's already a set of engineers and PMs and designers and all of these people on hand who are interested in these topics and then can go out and try to help them during our hackathon weeks or just in their free time. But so that's just me.
That's probably going to come in there and saying, clearly there's a lot of technology companies that I admire, and LBG and the area I work with as well. You know, we're partnering with Google at the moment, looking at cloud technologies and some of the qualifications that we then get from Google that people like myself and others can benefit from. We work with a lot of partners too in the recruitment world, you know, like Sapient and some of the other organisations where they've got people in other parts of the world that come in and work with us too. But I think also I was just going to take the point in a slightly different direction, and it's more like a personal sense that if there's something which is part of the bigger picture for individual employees of an organisation, and there's some commonality in that goal, I think that is what's really, really interesting, and it's that in itself that that drives that momentum of people wanting to work together, and that might be in a so. It's a little difficult to say it's people outside of your direct competitor world, but it is something about having that future focus of a combined group of people and something outside of, for example, in my world, banking, that stretches and interests people together.
I think from my point of view, something I've seen that's been really quite interesting in the leasing industry is an example of tech for profit and for good, which is sort of the ideal, because we're pushing in the right direction and people are making money, and that's electric cars. So there's been a real shift towards that recently in the leasing industry. I mean, they started out very expensive and maybe not very big ranges, and people have been very interested. Technology has really pushed them forward, made them realistic. Prices are starting to come down. And it's just that perfect thing. We're actually doing something that's going to make such a difference to the environment in the long run. At the same time, there's good signs that they're going to be a good deal better than the alternative in the long run. Less pollution, fewer moving parts, more maintainable. From the point of view of a leasing company, it's great because they don't break down as often and they retain their value more, and yet it's also a force for good. So we've got profit and ethics driving in the right direction there.
Sorry again. So I've been in very intense conversations around what is an ethical battery. So we're sitting here in the UK talking about renewable energy, wind energy, solar energy, electric cars. Everything has batteries. Who is sponsoring this? The children from Congo, from the cobalt belt. And now 80% of that battery market is controlled by China. So, so everything comes from China, most of them, except the Tesla Gigafactory, things like that. The question here is, how far do you dig into that?
Into the supply chain,
Into the supply chain.
It's very
It's
interesting.
managed by China, but isn't the actual mineral somewhere from the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Exactly.
And nobody in the Democratic Republic of Congo is having any of the benefits, or very few of the technology that we're talking about.
And we're so proud to talk about it, so green, and who cares about Congo and Africa and everything?
And we should do. Yeah.
What's the ethical battery? Our mobile phones, everything is based on the cobalt. So obviously people are looking into new materials to replace the cobalt. Again, it goes into deep sea mining and all kinds of things, asteroid and bits and pieces. But that's good thing is that we are asking these questions right now.
So actually, I'd love to dig a little bit more into that in a sort of slightly tangential way. Whose job is it to educate people about this then?
Well, it's very interesting about something like the Democratic Republic of Congo, because if anybody's interested, I just read a book recently by a guy called Tim Butcher, who's a journalist, and he went all the way down the Congo himself. But ultimately, just to summarize, what he was saying was that, in the way that we can have instant news globally, you've got a huge country that actually is going backwards and regressing in its, must be one of the few or only countries in the whole world that's doing that. And yet, who is interested? There's genocide, there's all sorts of major issues there. And it's actually, is it because it doesn't touch many of us directly every day? I don't know the answer, but I think that we do have a moral responsibility to be able to encourage people to read or to understand the whole supply chain or the whole consequences of some of these big topics. Yeah.
I guess I have my own kind of question, sort of picking up on some of the things that have been said. So we talked about earlier about regulations and how it's helped, and I guess recently lots of people released, because of regulations, I guess there are gender pay gaps for women and things like that. I guess my question I'm posing now is do you guys think it would be valuable if companies also had to publish how sustainable something was, or maybe how much carbon or emissions were released from the products that we end up buying? It's otherwise, how else would we know unless we're following everything as users all the way down to the bottom? The only one that's going to give us the real fact of the number is going to be able to be the company.
Well, you have to
Possibly.
trust that they're going to give you the right information.
Yeah.
Right? They're not going to lie about their emissions, like all these companies who know the cars have done, and that was regulation induced. They have to submit their emissions numbers. Okay, we'll just program the computer to not tell the right numbers. I think, here's the deal on all of this stuff. You have to have a solution. So it's one thing to say, okay, there's a problem, which we know there's a problem. But then if no one's putting forward a solution, that makes it really hard to change. So that's where social entrepreneurs are extremely valuable to the ecosystem, because that's exactly what they do. They take a social problem and they come up with an enterprising idea and an entrepreneurial way to solve that problem. So I think that's where social entrepreneurs are extremely valuable. I think a lot of women gravitate towards social entrepreneurship because a lot of women naturally want to solve problems and make lives better. So, for me, that's where it gets exciting, where the government says, right, we're going to hold a competition to see who can come up with an alternative sustainable battery, and we're going to fund that company, and or get the big companies on board. So I think that's it's one thing to say, yes, there's a problem. It's another thing to say, what things can we put in place to create the solutions we want to see?
And if maybe I can respond also to Holly's question. So in a simple way, I'd say yes, you could do that, but only if the data and the information is it's truthful, it's seen in a democratic way, and it's transparent, and to what Holly has just said about social engineer, entrepreneurs taking an agenda forward. I think I don't know a huge amount about it, but about blockchain technology could answer and maybe give those levels of transparency. But actually, it would need to be something which is more of a mass agenda of people collectively coming together and saying, well, that's what they want. So it'd be interesting to see how that might progress over the next couple of years.
It is also interesting what it would do to small companies, because it could be quite costly putting together this sort of information. So again, you wouldn't want to block any work they were doing. But I think if there was a readily available, easy way of collecting that data and tracking it, then it would be a very beneficial thing. I'd certainly be very interested to see that sort of information from companies I was working with.
So, two things. I don't know a lot about blockchain, but what I know is that it consumes a lot of power. And where is the power coming from? In terms of energy. The second thing is, it's the core, I believe, in all this stuff, is human behavior. We can have all the blockchain solutions and all the tech solutions, but unless we can convince humans to go through it, it's very hard. One of the things we're working on now is that in the UK, the British government is contemplating making 35% or 30% plastic in a packaging as to be recycled plastic. But the recycled plastic is expensive than virgin plastic. And this waste management industry is full of fraud. And the moment the regulation comes in the scenario, they're going to go to, say, outside the UK, maybe in Poland or any of those countries, just make it very convoluted and hard for people to understand, and start selling it. Now the question, the challenge for the government here is, how do you ensure that this is actually 30% recycled plastic and not the claim that they're doing? Blockchain is what, I'm looking for some help, if there is something around blockchain that can solve this thing. But also biggest challenge is the behavior change, because so full of fraud. I mean, I have a friend who has a recycling business. He was thinking that the recycled plastic is going to point A, but actually was going to point B, C, D, and E. He found out when he put GPS trackers on all the trucks. Wow. And but he's signing off the goods out of his recycling factory that's going to this address. But no, the truck's going all over the country and outside the UK. So it's really hard. And how can we have some more transparency without costing a lot and human behavior? It's very complex for me so far.
Grab that phone. But actually, that's when you're talking about the labels and things. Okay, so when I was a kid, they didn't have to put on the clothing labels where the clothing came from, right? That was human behavior that said, we want to know where our clothes are coming from. And then also when I was a kid, you didn't have the labels that said this is red, high in fat, high in sugar. You didn't have any of that. It never said any of those things. So I think human behavior is important, and when we start demanding those things, it does change. I said earlier this morning, we have a lot to thank the millennials for. Flexible working is one of them. I think this demand for more transparency, more honesty is another one. And I do think, and that's an amazing story about the recycling guy, but I think also this is where I like to tell the women that go through our program that social media is a real thing that really does change the world, because you can get the chicken farms that are doing the awful things with their chickens. You can film them, and stick them on the internet, and people can see what's really happening. So, that's where it's like we need to actually, we need to embrace that and allow things like that. But there's websites like change.org, and also the petitions, any of those things where you're getting mass groups of people getting behind something that's forcing the grocery stores to say where their eggs are coming from. And so I do think the human behavioral change is essential to this, but also we now live in an environment where that stuff's coming to the surface, and that's a good thing.
Sorry, talking about change.org and the petitions and everything. I have done a lot of petitions myself. In fact, I was supposed to do this weekend, but anyway. So 1 million people for the Brexit petition for 3 hours. That's 3 million hours. What happened? Nothing happened. They said, no, we're not going to consider any of your stuff. 10 million people asking Sainsbury's to stop plastic packaging. What happened? Nothing happened, really. But instead of that 10 million signatures, if people had sent 10 million letters with return postage to be paid by Sainsbury's, that's at least 10 million pounds. 10 million tweets. And then, when you hit them where it hurts, the financial numbers, then they're gonna definitely respond. So this is a different way of looking into like this kind of how do we make it happen. So I had an interesting chat with someone really interesting who was telling me all these ideas like last week. I was so amazed that he was like putting value to all this stuff, how you can make it more effective. Like Greta's campaign, for example, now for climate change, right? There are many things can be done to make it more effective, like give micro wins, short-term wins, not going for the big one. But so what can we do to make it more effective and get people really take some action, but nothing to do with tech, but
Smart interesting.
So on the note of that question, what can we do? We're going to finish up with our last question for all of you, which is that you have an audience of bright, capable women who are going into the workforce and who are interested in technology. So what is the kernel, key, fundamental piece of advice that you have learned, you have understood from your experiences and from your own work that you can give to them at this particular point in their careers when they're about to go out and hopefully start working on tech for good?
I'll start, so again. I would ask them to start their own business. Yeah, start your own, solve it. Take a problem, solve it. Because if you're starting your career, this is the right time to do something. If you don't do it now, you'll never be able to do it. You'll get in the corporate ladder and start getting more liabilities and things like liabilities and bits and pieces. One year, there's nothing to lose. Pick a problem. We have a lot of problems to solve right now. And I think we'll be able to support them in different ways. But we want them to solve the problem using technology to scale and things like that. Like start something.
Yeah, I like that. I would say be the change you want to see. And there's a really great Henry Ford quote that said, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. And it took me 10 years to understand what that means. When I was in my early 20s, I never even knew that you could be a business owner, right? So my parents were realtors, they sold real estate. I didn't know anyone who ran their own business. I just assumed, I don't know what I assumed, I just assumed everyone worked for someone. It wasn't until I had kids and I found myself sidelined from work that I felt like I wanted to do something, but I didn't want to not be with my kids. So I built a company around my kids. That was the first one. And I've still continued to do that. I would just say, as a woman who is almost 40, who's been running my own thing for the last 11 years, I would say it's hard work, but it's 100% worth it. And I think any woman going into business now is so lucky. And so if you can't find a company that you really feel aligns with your values and that can provide you with the opportunities that you want, and you have an idea, there's funding out there and there's people out there to help you do it. So I would really encourage you to go that path. It is not an easy path. It is definitely the path less trodden, and it is definitely the harder path. But I know for a fact I would not want to do anything differently. So if you see a problem that needs solving and no one's solving it, go get the funding, go get the mentoring, go get the support, build the team, and do it.
I would say most young women, when they're going into the workforce, will probably join a company at least initially. So I definitely agree with find a company that shares your values. And there are so many great companies out there to work for. And also one that will hopefully give you the freedom to be able to innovate and to experiment and to learn so that you can come up with these great ideas and solve these problems. And then maybe you can continue with that company, or maybe you can then spin out on your own. And I think there's so many great opportunities out there for doing tech for good.
Yeah, for me, I think the thing I've learned throughout my career is that you just keep on learning, and you need to keep on learning. And it's not because that's imposed upon you. I think right now, for me, it's because the people around me are learning, and I want to be part of that. So it's quite organic, but it's people-driven. And my second point would be about the people. So the thing that really fascinates me is that we have just been talking a lot about technology and about the tools. But in actual fact, it is the people that make those teams and do that work, and how you interact with people. And if you can do that well, and you enjoy it, and you enjoy working with the people that you are working with, you will do good.
Yeah, so my best advice is to find a mentor. I've benefited a lot from various mentors that I've had in my career, male and female, internal to Microsoft, external to Microsoft, technical and non-technical. Each one of them has given me something different to learn from. Each one of them inspires me in a different way and have helped me kind of get to the next stages in my career and help me kind of identify really where I want my career to go and the path that it can take. At least I'm at the beginning of my career. I'm about 9 months into my job now. But already I've been able to do a lot of the things I've only ever been able to dream about before because I have had this incredible mentorship support system behind me that have been able to kind of guide me and help me through the challenging times, the times where you face imposter syndrome, the times where you don't really know how to deal with a difficult situation, and the times that you even have just like a technical problem. There are great mentorship schemes all around London. At least one that I've participated in for like young women is called like the Students to STEMettes mentorship scheme. A lot of people probably here have heard of the STEMettes. There's a great organization, and so that was like a 6-month program that paired me with a mentor, and it was like right at the start of my placement, and so having some kind of like external sounding board was really helpful to me to kind of give me some perspective on the industry. And so I suggest going out to try to find like mentorship schemes or just even someone within your circle that you look up to ask them just to help you, because I think we've said earlier is most people are happy to give up their time to do it because it's an honor, really. So that's my best advice.
Cool, all right. So on that note, we will conclude our panel on Tech for Good. I'd just like to take the opportunity to say thank you very much to all of our speakers and panelists for today. It's been, I think, a really sort of compelling conversation that we've been having, so thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. And to our audience, I hope you can take away a few of the things that we've been talking about today, and really looking forward to seeing how you take them back to your businesses, to your courses, to your universities, to really see if you can drive tech for good where you are. Thank you.